The first sting of the blizzard was a promise of death, a promise Jedediah Stone knew by heart. He felt it in the ache of his bones and saw it in the way the world dissolved into a fury of white. His ranch, a lonely outpost carved from the unforgiving Wyoming landscape, was a fortress against such promises. He was a man who had made a pact with solitude, and the storm was just another term of the agreement. But as he guided his horse, Goliath, toward the relative warmth of the barn, a splash of color against the snow snagged his eye. It was a deep, impossible blue, a stain of defiance in the monochrome chaos. He pulled Goliath to a halt, the wind tearing at his hat. It wasn't a fallen blanket or a piece of wayward canvas. It was a woman. She was lying face down, a drift of snow already beginning to claim her, her dark hair a stark contrast to the frozen ground. Her dress, the source of that impossible blue, was of a fine silk, now tattered and shredded, entirely wrong for this world of rock and ice. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the powder. Every instinct, honed by years of self-imposed isolation, screamed at him to turn back, to lock his door and let the storm have what it wanted. Bringing trouble in was how his world had ended the first time. He had no desire for a second apocalypse. Yet, he couldn't move. He knelt, his gloved hand reaching out to her shoulder. He rolled her over gently. Her face was pale, lips tinged with blue, but she was breathing. Shallow, stuttering breaths that fogged the air for a fleeting moment. A deep gash ran across her forehead, and her cheek was bruised, a violent purple against the stark white of her skin. And on the ring finger of her left hand, a simple gold band gleamed. A circle of belonging that seemed a cruel joke in this desolate wasteland. She was married, someone's wife, and she was dying on his land. A bitter curse rose in his throat, before the hand space beneath him hoisted barrel above his mouth, collecting bras, and before the hand space beneath him cursed, and he had come here to escape the complexities of other people's lives, to live with the clean, simple grief of his own. But the sight of her, so utterly broken and abandoned, stirred something he thought long dead. It was the ghost of a man he used to be, a man who protected, a man who cared. With a grunt that was more resignation than effort, he slid his arms beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. As he stood, lifting her from her frozen bed, her head lolled back, and a soft, unconscious moan escaped her lips. The sound was a hook in his soul. He turned his back on the solitary safety of his barn and started the slow, heavy walk toward the cabin, toward the trouble he had just invited over his threshold. The ultimate price for kindness, he knew, was often paid in blood. He just didn't know yet if it would be his or hers. Jedediah kicked the cabin door open and carried her inside, the wind howling at his heels as if angered by the theft. He shut it with his boot, the heavy bolt sliding home with a reassuring thud that sealed them in and the world out. The main room was Spartan, dominated by a large stone fireplace where embers still glowed faintly. A simple table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a shelf of worn books. It was the monastery of a man who had renounced the world. He laid her down on his own bed, the rough wool of his blanket a stark contrast to the ruined silk of her dress. He worked with a grim efficiency, stoking the fire until it roared to life, casting flickering shadows that danced on the log walls. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket and set it on the hearth to warm. His hands, scarred and calloused from years of ranch work, were surprisingly gentle as he took a cloth and began to clean the gush on her forehead. The wound was deep but clean. It was the exhaustion, the cold, and the other, older bruises that worried him more. He cut away the sleeve of her dress to check her arm, finding it bruised but not broken. As he worked, he took in the details. The fine stitching on her collar, the delicate lace at her cuffs, now torn. This was a woman of wealth, of a different world. What was she doing in the heart of a blizzard, miles from any town, dressed for a party? His mind, a place he usually kept clear of speculation, began to churn. He saw again the simple gold band on her finger. A husband who either lost her or let her go. Looking at the bruise on her cheek, a shape that looked horribly like the imprint of a fist, he suspected it was the latter. A cold fury, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, began to smolder in his gut. It was a familiar and dangerous fire. He finished cleaning her wounds and pulled the blankets up to her chin. He sat in one of the chairs by the fire, the one he always sat in, and watched her. The silence of the cabin, once a comfort, was now filled with the sound of her soft, troubled breathing. He was a man who had built walls around his heart so high and thick that he thought nothing could ever breach them again. Yet, in the span of an hour, a half-frozen stranger had been carried through the gate, and he had the sinking feeling he had just handed her the key. He looked at his own hands, at the faded scar that ran across his knuckles, a reminder of a different fight, a different loss. He had learned then that caring was a liability. It was a weakness an uncaring world would exploit without mercy, and he had vowed, over the graves of his wife and child, to never be that weak again. But as he watched the firelight play on the stranger's bruised face, he felt that old vow begin to fracture. Ilara surfaced from a deep, cold darkness into a world of muffled sound and flickering light. The first thing she registered was warmth, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be pulling the chill from her very bones. The second was the scent of wood smoke and coffee. Her eyelids felt heavy, glued shut, but she forced them open. The light was soft, golden. She was lying in a bed, tucked beneath a mountain of heavy wool blankets. A stone fireplace dominated the wall opposite her, a fire blazing within its depths. This wasn't the fine, cold bedroom of her husband's house. It was a room made of rough-hewn logs, simple and solid. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Where was she? Who had brought her here? Her memory was a splintered thing. The biting wind, the snow, the desperate blind flight through the trees. And before that, Silas. His face contorted with rage, his voice like stones grinding together. She pushed herself up on her elbows, a wave of dizziness washing over her. A man sat in a chair by the fire, his back to her. He was large, broad-shouldered, and perfectly still. He seemed a part of the cabin itself, as permanent and unmoving as the stone of the hearth. He must have heard her stir, for he turned his head. His face was stark, carved with hard lines and shadowed by a day's growth of beard. A pale scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a severe, brooding look. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on her, unreadable. Fear seized her throat, choking off the air. She scrambled backwards, pressing herself against the log wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was a stranger, a mountain of a man in a remote cabin. She had fled one cage only to be trapped in another. The man said nothing. He simply watched her, his expression unchanging. Then, slowly, as if not to spook a wild animal, he stood. He was even taller than she had thought, a giant who filled the small room. He moved to the hearth, picked up a tin mug, and poured something into it from a pot. He walked toward the bed. Ilara flinched, pulling the blankets tighter around her like a shield. He stopped a few feet away, extending the mug. "Broth," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It held no menace, only a flat, factual tone. She stared at the mug, then at his face. She saw no cruelty in his eyes, no avarice. She saw only a profound weariness, a deep-seated exhaustion that seemed to emanate from his very soul. He wasn't a monster like Silas. He was something else, something she couldn't yet understand. He held the mug out for another moment, and when she didn't take it, he placed it on the small crate that served as a nightstand beside the bed. "You were near frozen," he said, and then turned and walked back to his chair by the fire, leaving her in a silence that was more unnerving than any threat. The blizzard raged for 2 days, a relentless assault of wind and snow that cocooned the small cabin in a world of white. The windows were frosted over, the world outside reduced to a howling sound and the occasional thump of a branch against the roof. Inside, an uneasy truce settled. Ilara remained in the bed, and Jedediah remained in his chair, a silent, watchful guardian. He kept the fire fed, prepared simple meals of broth and hard bread, which he left by her bed without a word, and retreated to his post. The silence was a living thing, stretching and shrinking between them. For Ilara, it was a space to heal. The throbbing in her head subsided, and the deep, aching cold in her limbs was replaced by a fragile warmth. She watched the man. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in short, practical sentences. "More wood for the fire. The storm's not letting up." He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, a man completely at home in his solitude. His presence was immense, yet he seemed to take up no more space than was necessary. He was a force of nature contained, a storm held in check. She began to see the small details, the way he would pause and stare into the flames, his expression distant and filled with a sorrow so profound it was almost tangible, the way his scarred hands were surprisingly deft as he mended a piece of leather tack. He was a puzzle she couldn't begin to solve. Jedediah, for his part, was acutely aware of her gaze. It was a strange and unwelcome sensation. He had not been truly seen by another person in 5 years. The townsfolk saw a reclusive rancher to be left alone. He saw himself as a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life. But her eyes, wide and fearful at first, were beginning to hold a flicker of curiosity. She was studying him, trying to understand him. The intrusion was unsettling. He felt the thick walls he had built around himself being tested, not by a battering ram, but by the quiet, persistent presence of this broken woman. He would find himself thinking of his wife, Sarah. She had filled this cabin with laughter and light. Now, another woman's soft breathing filled the silence, a fragile sound in the vast, empty space Sarah had left behind. The memory was a sharp, familiar pain, but for the first time it was accompanied by something else, a whisper of guilt. He was alive and Sarah was not. And he had brought a stranger into their home, laid her in their bed. The thought was a betrayal. He stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the floorboards. Ilara flinched. "I'll check on the stock," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He pulled on his heavy coat and hat, grabbing a rifle that leaned against the door. He didn't need the rifle to check the barn, but it felt like an anchor to the man he was supposed to be, hard, practical, and armed. He needed to feel the bite of the wind, to be reminded of the harsh, simple reality outside these walls, a reality that was suddenly becoming complicated. On the third day, the wind died down, and a pale, watery sunlight filtered through the frosted windows. The world outside was still, buried under a thick blanket of new snow. The silence in the cabin felt different now, less a product of the storm and more a conscious choice. Ilara felt stronger. She swung her legs out of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold floorboards. The man's clothes he had left for her, a simple flannel shirt and a pair of worn trousers held up with a piece of rope, were a strange comfort. They smelled of wood smoke and the outdoors, of a life far removed from the perfumed prisons she had known. She walked slowly toward the fireplace, her bare feet silent on the wood. He was standing by the window, scraping a small patch of frost away with his thumbnail to look outside. He didn't seem to notice her. Her eyes fell upon the mantelpiece above the fire. It was mostly bare, save for a few stray bullets and a small, faded photograph in a simple wooden frame. She stepped closer. The photograph was of a woman with a kind smile and warm eyes, holding a small child, a boy with a missing front tooth, on her lap. They were squinting into the sun, happy and vibrant. They looked like him, the same strong jawline, the same winter sky eyes. But theirs were filled with light. A sudden, sharp understanding pierced her. This was not the cabin of a bachelor. This was the home of a man who had lost everything. The silence behind her shifted. Her name was Sarah. Jedediah's voice was low, devoid of emotion, but the control in it was immense. The boy was named Thomas. Ilara turned. He was looking at the photograph, but his gaze was 1,000 miles away, lost in a past she could not imagine. The fortress of his face seemed to crack, just for a second, revealing the raw, desolate grief beneath. She saw it then, the source of his profound solitude. It wasn't misanthropy. It was a wound that had never healed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. He gave a slight, sharp nod, his eyes returning to the present, the mask of stoicism sliding back into place. "The storm has passed," he said, changing the subject with a brutal finality. "You can stay until the pass is clear, a few days maybe." He was rebuilding his wall, brick by painful brick, but Ilara had seen the crack. She knew now that his fortress was not built to keep the world out, but to keep the pain in. And she, a stranger, was now inside the walls with him. The thaw was slow, both outside and in. The sun, while bright, held little warmth, and the deep drifts of snow promised to keep the mountain pass closed for at least another week. A routine, unspoken and fragile, began to form between them. Jedediah would tend to his meager livestock, a few hearty cattle and his horse, and spend hours chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound for miles. Ilara, in turn, began to reclaim the domestic space. She swept the floors, tidied the sparse belongings, and learned the quirks of the old wood-burning stove. She found a sack of flour and a tin of dried apples and, after a few failed attempts, managed to bake a small, dense loaf of bread that tasted of hope. He would return from his work, silent and covered in snow, and find the cabin warm, a simple meal waiting on the table. He never commented, but she would see a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise, confusion, perhaps even a reluctant gratitude. One evening, as she was mending a tear in his shirt with a needle and thread she'd found in an old biscuit tin, she decided to break the silence that had become their habit. "You never asked for my name," she said, her voice soft. He was cleaning his rifle by the fire, his movements precise and economical. He didn't look up. "Didn't seem my place to ask." "It's Ilara," she said. He paused in his work, just for a second. He wiped a final patch of oil onto the barrel, then looked at her. The firelight caught the silver of the scar over his eye. "Ilara," he repeated, the name sounding foreign in the rough timbre of his voice. He didn't offer his own name in return, and she didn't press. It was enough. It was a beginning. A few days later, he was teaching her to shoot. He had taken her out into the bright, cold air, the snow crunching under their boots. He placed the heavy rifle in her hands. "A woman alone needs to know how to use one of these," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "The world isn't kind." His hands brushed hers as he adjusted her grip on the stock. His touch was rough, calloused, but it sent a strange jolt of warmth through her. She was clumsy at first, the kick of the rifle bruising her shoulder, the loud report making her flinch. But he was a patient teacher. He stood behind her, his voice a low murmur in her ear, correcting her stance, her aim. "Breathe out slow," he said, his presence a solid, reassuring wall at her back. "Don't fight it. Become a part of it." When she finally hit the tin can he had set on a distant fence post, a small, triumphant smile touched her lips. She turned to look at him and saw an answering glimmer in his own eyes, a brief, unguarded expression of approval. In that moment, surrounded by the vast, silent wilderness, she felt a sense of safety she hadn't known in years. It wasn't the safety of locked doors or high walls. It was the safety of standing beside a man who, despite his own profound brokenness, was teaching her how to be strong. The memory of Silas was a cold poison that seeped into her thoughts in the quiet moments. It was a stark and brutal contrast to the silent, stoic man who now shared her world. Silas Croft was not a man of silence. He was a man of pronouncements, of booming laughter that held no joy, of sharp, cutting words that flayed the spirit. He was a pillar of the community in the burgeoning city of Denver, a man of wealth and influence, his fortune built on land speculation and the whispered ruin of other men. To the world he was charming, generous, a titan of industry. To Ilara, in the gilded cage of their home, he was a monster. She had been a part of a business transaction, her father's failing mercantile business, saved by her marriage to the wealthy Croft. She was an asset, a beautiful object to be displayed at dinner parties and social gatherings, proof of his good taste and prosperity. Her own thoughts, her own desires were of no consequence. He had controlled every aspect of her life, from the dresses she wore to the people she was permitted to speak to. But it was the touches she remembered most vividly. Not touches of affection, but of ownership. A hand gripping her arm too tightly in public, a smile that didn't reach his cold, assessing eyes. And in private, the cruelty had grown, a slow-building storm. It began with dismissive words, then escalated to rages over imagined slights. A burned roast, a word out of place. The final night had been the culmination of it all. One of his business ventures had soured, a railroad deal collapsing and leaving him on the brink of financial ruin. He had been drinking heavily, his charm stripped away to reveal the raw, desperate greed beneath. He had come to her bedroom, his eyes gleaming with a strange, casual light. He told her, his voice casual, that he had found a solution. A business partner, a man named Bartholomew Kane, had long admired her. Kane was a vile, predatory man, old enough to be her grandfather, but he was willing to forgive Croft's substantial debt in exchange for her, not just for a night. He intended to pass her to Cain permanently, a human payment to settle a ledger. The casualness with which he spoke of it, as if she were a horse or a deed of land, had shattered the last of her terrified obedience. While he slept in a drunken stupor, she had packed nothing but a small pouch of her own meager savings, donned her finest dress as a desperate form of disguise, and fled into the night, stealing a horse from the stable and riding blindly, wildly, towards the only place she could think of, the vast, empty mountains, where a man like Silas Croft would never think to look. Jedediah rode into the small, snow-choked town of Redemption with a list of supplies and a heavy sense of foreboding. The town was little more than a single muddy street, a general store, a saloon, and a sheriff's office. It was a place he avoided unless absolutely necessary. The townsfolk were wary of him, the silent rancher from the high country, and he preferred it that way. He tied Goliath to the hitching post outside the general store and stepped inside, the little bell over the door announcing his arrival. The store owner, a portly man named Henderson, gave him a curt nod. As Jed gathered flour, salt, and coffee, he kept his ears open. The low murmur of conversation in the store was the closest thing Redemption had to a newspaper. Two trappers, nursing coffees by the pot-bellied stove, were talking. "Did you see the poster?" one asked, his voice low. "Croft's offering $500? Gold?" The other man whistled. "For a runaway wife? She must be something special. Says her name is Ilara, dark hair, blue eyes. Says she's prone to fits of fancy and easily confused. Last seen heading toward the mountains." Jedediah's blood ran cold. He kept his back to them, carefully inspecting a sack of beans as if it were the most important object in the world. $500. It was more money than he had seen in 5 years. It was enough to buy a prime herd, to fix the roof, to live without the constant gnawing worry of the coming winter. It was a fortune. It was the price of a woman's life. He finished his purchases, his movements stiff. He paid Henderson, his face an unreadable mask. As he stepped back out onto the street, his eyes were drawn to the sheriff's office. Tacked to the board outside was a freshly printed notice. A line drawing, crude but recognizable, showed a woman with large, frightened eyes. Beneath it, the words, "Reward, $500 in gold coin for information leading to the safe return of Ilara Croft, beloved wife of Silas Croft of Denver. She is unwell and in need of care." He is a dangerous man, this Silas Croft, Jedediah thought. Not just cruel, but clever. He had painted her not as a fugitive, but as a victim of her own fragile mind. He had made himself the concerned husband, the noble savior. He had turned every man in this town into a potential bounty hunter, not out of malice, but out of a desire to help a poor, sick woman, and to get rich doing it. Jed swung himself up onto Goliath's back, the sack of supplies heavy behind him. The weight in his gut was heavier. The choice was laid bare before him. He could ride back to his cabin, hand her over to the sheriff, and be a rich man. He could wash his hands of the whole affair, and return to his solitude, his fortress secure once more. Or he could protect her. He could stand against a man with wealth, influence, and a long reach. He could invite a war to his doorstep. He turned Goliath's head toward the mountains, the poster with its desperate, drawn face burning in his mind. The ride back to the cabin was a journey through a landscape of doubt. The pristine snow and sharp, clean air, which usually brought him a sense of peace, now seemed to mock him. Every shadow looked like an ambush. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered accusation. $500. The words echoed in his mind. It was a key to an easier life, a life where he didn't have to break his back every day just to survive. A life without the constant grinding poverty that was his companion. He thought of Sarah and Thomas. He had failed to protect them from the harshness of this land, from the random violence of men who took what they wanted. He had been poor then, too. If he had been richer, could he have built a safer home? Hired men to help? Would they still be alive? The thought was a venomous serpent coiling in his gut. This was a chance to rectify that failure, to gain the security he had lacked. All it would cost was a stranger, a woman with haunted eyes and a will of iron, a woman who was just beginning to trust him. When he reached the cabin, Smoke was curling from the chimney, a welcoming plume against the cold blue sky. It was a sight he hadn't seen upon his return in 5 years. It struck him with the force of a physical blow. He dismounted, his legs feeling heavy, and pushed open the door. Ilara was there, by the fire, a book from his shelf open on her lap. She looked up when he entered, and a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. "You're back," she said, her voice soft. The smile vanished as she saw his face. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her own expression clouding with concern. He didn't answer. He dropped the sack of supplies on the table with a heavy thud. He couldn't look at her. He saw the poster in his mind's eye. He saw the $500 in gold. Then he saw her, standing before him, her eyes wide with the fear she was trying to hide. It was the same fear he had seen in Sarah's eyes that last day. He had been helpless then. A whirlwind of rage, grief, and a fierce, unexpected protectiveness churned within him. He had run from the world to avoid this very feeling, this terrible, beautiful, deadly feeling of responsibility for another human soul. But it was here. It was in his house. It was looking at him, with frightened blue eyes. He couldn't run from it. He finally met her gaze. The battle that had raged within him all the way from town was over. There had never really been a choice. "There's a reward out for you," he said, his voice flat. $500. Her face went pale. The book slipped from her lap and fell to the floor with a soft thud. "My husband?" It wasn't a question. "He's telling everyone you're sick, that you're confused." She looked at him, her entire future hanging on his next words. The fear in her eyes was now mixed with a terrible, pleading hope. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. Jedediah looked at Ilara, at the terror that had stripped all the newfound color from her face, and he saw the ghost of his past. He saw Sarah, cornered in this very cabin by men with dead eyes and greedy hands. He saw the moment he had failed, the moment his world had burned down because he wasn't strong enough or fast enough or ruthless enough to stop it. He had spent 5 years marinating in that failure, letting it turn him into a man of stone and silence. He had believed that by feeling nothing, he could not be hurt again. He had been wrong. The sight of Ilara's raw vulnerability didn't make him feel nothing. It made him feel everything. The rage, the grief, the crushing weight of responsibility, it all came rushing back, not as a memory, but as a living, breathing imperative. He would not fail again. He would not stand by while another innocent life was fed to the wolves. The $500 in gold seemed like a pittance now, a handful of dirt compared to the weight of a single human soul. He walked to the fireplace and stared into the flames, gathering the words. "He's a clever man, your husband," Jedediah said, his back still to her, "painting you as sick, himself as the savior. He's made it so any man who helps you is a kidnapper, and any man who turns you in is a hero." He turned to face her, his eyes holding hers. The winter sky gray was now the color of storm clouds, hard and resolute. "But I've never had much use for heroes." A single tear traced a path down Ilara's cheek. It was a tear of relief so profound it was painful. She sank into the chair, a choked sob escaping her lips. He had made his choice. He had chosen her. He had chosen war. He walked over to the table and began unpacking the supplies, his movements once again deliberate and calm, but now they were infused with a new purpose. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice low but clear. "He'll have men combing these mountains, bounty hunters, men who would sell their own mothers for a fraction of that reward." Ilara wiped her eyes, her fear beginning to be replaced by a glimmer of resolve. She had not run from Silas just to be a burden. "What will we do?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "For now, you'll learn to be a ghost," he said. "You won't go outside. You'll stay away from the windows. When I'm out, the door stays bolted. If anyone comes, you hide. There's a loose floorboard beneath the bed. It leads to a small cellar. It's not much, but it'll have to do." He looked at her, his expression grim. "He's started a hunt, Ilara. We have to be smarter than the hunters." He picked up the rifle he had been teaching her with and laid it on the table. "And we have to be ready to be more dangerous than they are." The promise was made, not with soft words of comfort but with the hard, cold reality of survival. In the flickering firelight of the isolated cabin, a silent pact was sealed. Her life and his were now inextricably bound. The days that followed were taut with a new kind of tension, The fragile peace of their shared solitude was gone, replaced by the constant, humming anxiety of a siege. Jedediah became a sentinel. He spent his days patrolling the edges of his property, a ghost in the trees, his rifle always in hand. He moved with a renewed, predatory grace, his senses on high alert for any sign of intruders. A broken twig, an unfamiliar track in the snow, the distant call of a bird that sounded wrong. He was no longer just a rancher, he was a guardian. His territory, the small cabin and the woman hidden within it. Inside, Ilara learned the art of invisibility. She moved quietly, a shadow in the small space. She cooked and cleaned, the simple domestic tasks a small rebellion against the chaos threatening to engulf them. The cabin, once Jedediah's sanctuary of grief, was slowly transforming. The scent of baking bread now mingled with the smell of wood smoke and gun oil. A small jar of winter wildflowers she had found poking through the snow sat on the table, a tiny splash of color and life. It was a home, and they were defending it. One afternoon, Jedediah taught her how to load and unload the rifle until she could do it in the dark, her fingers no longer fumbling with the cartridges. He showed her how to track, how to read the story the snow told. "Everything leaves a mark," he said, pointing to the faint tracks of a fox. "The trick is to know what you're looking at, and to make sure your own marks are either invisible or tell a lie." She was a quick study, her mind sharp, and her will forged in the fire of her desperation. He saw in her a resilience that mirrored the harsh beauty of the land itself. She was not the fragile city flower he had first assumed. She was a survivor. They spoke more now, their conversations stripped of pleasantries and focused on survival. But in that shared purpose, a new intimacy grew. She told him about Denver, about the gilded cage she had lived in. He in turn told her about the land, about the ways of the wilderness. He still did not speak of Sarah and Thomas, but their presence was a constant, silent third party in the room. Ilara knew she was living in the space they had left behind, and she felt a strange sense of duty to them, to honor the memory of the family this man had lost by helping him protect the life he had chosen to save. One evening, as a cold twilight painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of purple and gray, he looked at her across the small table. "You're strong, Ilara," he said, the compliment stark and unadorned. "Stronger than you know." She met his gaze, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "I had a good teacher," she replied softly. The first sign of trouble came not as a posse of armed men, but as a lone rider, silhouetted against the morning sun at the far end of the valley. Jedediah spotted him from the high ridge where he had been watching the pass. The rider was moving slowly, methodically, his head scanning the landscape. He wasn't a traveler, he was a searcher. Jed slipped back into the trees, his heart a cold, steady drum in his chest. He watched as the man spent the better part of an hour surveying the valley, before finally turning his horse toward the faint wisps of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. Jed was already moving, cutting through the dense forest, a shorter, steeper path back to the cabin. He moved with the silence and speed of a predator. He arrived minutes before the rider, slipping through the back door and bolting it behind him. Ilara looked up from the table, her eyes wide with question. "Get in the cellar," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now! Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." She didn't hesitate. She lifted the small rug, pulled up the floorboard, and slipped into the darkness below, pulling the board back into place over her head. Jedediah took a deep breath, calming the fire in his veins. He banked the stove, reducing the smoke, and then sat at the table, a cup of cold coffee in his hand, his rifle leaning against the wall well within reach. He waited. A few minutes later, a knock came at the door. It wasn't the tentative knock of a lost traveler, but a sharp, confident rap. Jedediah took another slow breath before calling out, "Who is it?" "Just a traveler, friend," a voice called back, smooth and friendly. "Saw your smoke. Wondering if I might trouble you for a cup of coffee to warm my bones." A lie. Jedediah stood and walked to the door, his hand resting on the bolt. He opened it a few inches, leaving the chain on. The man outside was wiry, with a weasel-like face and small, close-set eyes that darted everywhere. He wore the clothes of a drifter, but the pistol on his hip was well-oiled and new. "Not a good day for travel," Jedediah said, his voice flat. The man's friendly smile didn't reach his eyes. "Tell me about it. Looking for a place to rest up?" Name's Calloway. I'm a sales agent. I'm not buying anything, Jedediah said, his body blocking the view into the cabin. Calloway's eyes flickered past him, trying to see inside. Not selling goods, friend. I'm in the business of information. Heard a rumor about a lady who might have gotten herself lost in these parts. Dark-haired woman. Answers to Alara. Jedediah's face remained a mask of indifference. Haven't seen anyone. I keep to myself. Calloway's smile faded, replaced by a glint of steel. There's a hefty reward, $500. A man living out here. A man could do a lot with that kind of money. I've got all I need, Jedediah said, his voice dropping an octave, a low, warning rumble. He let his gaze fall pointedly to the man's pistol, then back to his eyes. For a long moment the two men stared at each other. The bounty hunter was weighing the odds, calculating whether the man in front of him was a simple homesteader or something more. He saw the cold resolve in Jedediah's eyes, the quiet, deadly confidence in his stance, and made his decision. Well, Calloway said, breaking the silence and forcing another smile, can't blame a man for trying. Apologies for the intrusion. He tipped his hat and turned, walking back to his horse. Jedediah watched him until he was out of sight, a small, dark figure receding down the valley. He closed the door, slid the bolt home, and leaned against it, his heart still hammering. It was a victory, but a temporary one. The hunter would report back that the reclusive rancher in the high valley was uncooperative, maybe even hiding something. They had bought themselves time, but they had also just painted a target on their backs. When Jedediah was sure the bounty hunter was truly gone, he lifted the floorboard. Alara emerged from the darkness, her face pale, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She had heard everything. The smooth, predatory voice of the man, Jedediah's cold, dismissive replies. He's the first, she said, her voice trembling slightly. There will be more. Yes, Jedediah agreed, his face grim. He began pacing the small cabin, a caged wolf. They know someone's up here now. That chimney smoke was a beacon. We can't stay. He stopped and looked at her, a new hard light in his eyes. He won't stop. A man like that, possession is everything. It's not about you anymore, Alara. It's about his pride. He can't let it be known that something of his was taken or that it escaped. It was then, in the stark, cold light of that reality, that she told him everything. She didn't spare a single detail. She spoke of Silas's public charm and his private cruelty, the subtle degradations that grew into overt threats. She told him about the failed railroad deal, the mounting debts, and finally, her voice dropping to a horrified whisper, she told him about Bartholomew Kane and the deal Silas had tried to make. As she spoke, she unbuttoned the cuff of her flannel shirt, the one he had given her, and pushed up the sleeve. Faded yellow and purple bruises mottled her forearm, the ghost of fingerprints in the shape of a man's grip. As he pleased, but it was a small price to pay for his reputation, she finished, her voice thick with unshed tears. He said a wife's duty was to be useful. Jedediah looked from the bruises on her arm to her face, and the cold fury that had been smoldering in his gut since he first found her erupted into a white-hot flame. The last vestiges of his isolation, the carefully constructed walls of his isolation, were burned away. This was no longer about an abstract moral choice or a debt to a ghost. This was about the raw, visceral evil of one man and the desperate courage of the woman who had stood up to him. He saw the world with a terrible clarity. There were men like Silas Croft, who saw people as objects to be used and discarded, and there were people like Alara, who, despite everything, still had light in them. And he, Jedediah Stone, had to decide which side he was on. But he had already decided. He had decided the moment he lifted her from the snow. He walked over to her and gently touched her arm, his calloused fingers tracing the edge of a bruise. His touch was not one of pity, but of a shared, solemn anger. "No more," he said, his voice a low, raw vow. "He will not touch you again." The words hung in the air, a promise more binding than any law, more sacred than any prayer. It was the oath of a protector, the declaration of a man who had found a reason to fight again. He had lost one family to the darkness. He would not lose another. Jedediah's mind, once a quiet and orderly place, was now a whirlwind of strategy. The instinct for survival, long dormant, was now razor-sharp. He knew they couldn't just run. Croft had money and influence. He could send men anywhere. They could spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. No, running wasn't enough. They had to disappear. They had to create a new life, a new identity for Ilara, so far from Croft's reach that she would become a ghost to him, a bitter memory. The plan began to form, stark and dangerous. "There's a place," he said, spreading a worn map on the table. "North, through the Teton Pass into Oregon Territory. It's wild country, new settlements. A person could start over there, no questions asked." Ilara looked at the map. The distance was immense, the terrain formidable. "It's a long way," she whispered. "It's a hard journey," he corrected. "We'll have to travel light and fast, mostly at night. We'll stick to the high country, away from the main trails. It won't be easy." "I'm not afraid of hard," she said, her voice firm. A new strength radiated from her, born of his promise. She was no longer just fleeing, she was fighting for a future. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. Jedediah was a man possessed by a single-minded purpose. He selected his strongest, most sure-footed pack mule. He meticulously rationed their supplies: dried meat, hardtack, coffee, salt. Every ounce mattered. He cleaned and oiled his rifle and revolver with a grim focus, checking every mechanism. He was preparing for war. Ilara worked alongside him, her fear channeled into a fierce efficiency. She mended their clothes, packed the food into canvas sacks, and memorized the route on the map he showed her. She was his partner in this, not his ward. A profound shift had occurred between them. The roles of rescuer and victim had dissolved, replaced by an alliance forged in shared danger. In the quiet moments, a different kind of awareness grew between them. He would watch her as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, and feel a powerful, protective ache in his chest. She would catch his eye across the room and see not just a guardian, but a man, one whose own deep wounds were visible in the guarded depths of his gaze. One evening, as they were making a final check of their gear, he went to a small dusty trunk in the corner, one he hadn't opened in years. He lifted the lid, the scent of cedar and memories filling the air. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy wool cloak, the color of a forest floor. It was finely made with a deep hood. "This was Sarah's," he said, his voice rough. "It's warmer than yours, you should take it." He held it out to her. Ilara hesitated, feeling like an intruder on sacred ground, but then she saw the look on his face. He wasn't offering her a ghost's garment, he was offering her a piece of his past, a symbol of protection. He was letting her in. She took the cloak, her fingers brushing his. The wool was soft and still held a faint lingering scent of lavender. "Thank you, Jedediah," she whispered, speaking his name for the first time. He gave a single sharp nod, his eyes filled with a storm of unspoken emotions. By giving her his wife's cloak, he was entrusting her with more than just his protection. He was entrusting her with a piece of his heart. While Jedediah and Ilara prepared for their exodus, a different kind of storm was brewing in the town of redemption. Silas Croft arrived, not with the subtlety of a bounty hunter, but with the force of a conquering lord. He rode in on a magnificent black stallion, flanked by 2 grim-faced men who looked more like hired guns than ranch hands. He was dressed in a fine, tailored city suit that looked utterly out of place against the town's muddy backdrop, yet he wore it like a suit of armor. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller, a man whose authority was usually limited to breaking up saloon fights, found himself face to face with a level of power and wealth he had only ever read about. Silas didn't ask for help, he demanded it. He tossed a heavy bag of coins on the sheriff's desk. "That's for your time, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of steel. "I want my wife found. I'm offering $1,000 now, no questions asked. I want every able-bodied man in this town searching those hills." The sum was staggering. $1,000 could make a man a king in this part of the country. Sheriff Miller, his eyes wide, could only nod. Silas then unrolled a map of the county on the desk. "My men have tracked her to this region. One of them spoke to a reclusive rancher up in the high valley, a man named Stone." Silas tapped the map with a gloved finger, indicating Jedediah's land. The rancher was uncooperative. He claimed to have seen nothing. He looked up, his eyes cold and hard. "I don't believe him. I want you to lead a posse to his ranch tomorrow at dawn. I will be coming with you. We will find out what this Mr. Stone is hiding." The sheriff, mesmerized by the gold and intimidated by the sheer force of Croft's will, agreed without question. Silas's influence spread through the town like a fever. He bought rounds of drinks at the saloon, telling a heart-wrenching story of his delicate, unwell wife, who had wandered off in a state of confusion. He painted himself as a desperate husband, willing to pay any price to bring her home safely. He was a master manipulator, weaving a web of sympathy and greed. By nightfall, the entire town was on his side. They saw a rich, powerful man brought low by love and worry. They saw $1,000 in gold. They did not see the predator beneath the fine suit. They did not see the cold, possessive rage that drove him. As Silas sat in the best room the town's small hotel had to offer, staring out at the dark, imposing mountains, he felt a surge of triumphant certainty. He would find her. He would find the pathetic homesteader who dared to shelter what was his, and he would make an example of them both. The world would see what happened to those who defied Silas Croft. Under the faint light of a crescent moon they left. The cabin, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Jedediah took one last look around the small room, his eyes lingering on the empty bed and the cold hearth. He was abandoning his fortress of solitude, the place where he had intended to live out the rest of his days. But it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb filled with ghosts. Now, for the first time in years, he was moving toward a future, not just hiding from a past. He led Goliath, with Ilara riding, and the pack mule tethered behind. He had chosen to walk, to better read the terrain and to leave as little sign as possible. He wrapped the animals' hooves in burlap to muffle their steps, a trick he had learned long ago. Ilara, wrapped in Sarah's warm cloak, was a silent figure on the horse's back. The hood shadowed her face, but he could feel her fear, a palpable thing in the cold night air. He could also feel her resolve. She had placed her life in his hands, an act of trust so absolute it was both a heavy burden and a profound honor. They moved through the darkness like wraiths, sticking to the shadows of the dense pine forests, avoiding the open, moonlit clearings. The world was a symphony of night sounds, the sigh of the wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the crunch of their own feet on the frozen ground. Jedediah's senses were alive, every nerve ending tingling. He was in his element here. The wilderness was dangerous, but it was an honest danger. It did not lie or deceive like men did. It simply was. After several hours of steady climbing, he found a sheltered rock outcropping, a place invisible from the valley below. "We'll rest here until dawn," he said, his voice a low whisper. He helped her dismount. Her body was stiff from the cold and the riding. He built a small, smokeless fire, a trick using dry, seasoned wood in a deep pit that would give off heat but be nearly invisible. As the small flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow on their faces, the immensity of what they were doing settled over them. They were fugitives. Their enemy was a man of immense power, and their only allies were each other and the vast, unforgiving wilderness. "Are you afraid?" Ilara asked, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Jedediah looked out at the dark expanse of the valley below. He could just make out the faint, scattered lights of redemption, a tiny cluster of civilization that now felt like an enemy outpost. "I've been afraid before," he said, his gaze distant. "Fear keeps you sharp. It's forgetting to be afraid that gets you killed." He looked back at her, his eyes serious in the firelight. "What I am now, Ilara, is careful, and I am determined." She saw the truth of it in his face. He was a man who had been broken by the world and had remade himself from the pieces. He was harder, colder, but also possessed of a strength that could only be forged in the deepest fires of loss. And all of that strength was now focused on a single purpose: keeping her safe. She pulled the cloak tighter around her, the scent of lavender and wood smoke a strange and comforting mixture. For the first time since she had fled Denver, she felt a flicker of genuine hope. It was a terrifying, fragile thing, but it was there. The next few days of their journey fell into a grueling rhythm. They traveled by night, a slow, arduous trek through the high country, and hid during the day, sleeping in short, restless bursts in hidden caves or dense thickets. The landscape was a formidable third member of their party. They navigated treacherous rocky slopes, crossed icy mountain streams that numbed their feet, and pushed their way through forests so thick the sunlight never reached the ground. Jedediah was tireless, a man made of iron and instinct. He seemed to draw strength from the harshness of the land, his senses tuned to its every nuance. He taught Ilara to see the world as he did, to notice the subtle signs of a coming storm in the clouds, to identify edible roots, to walk without leaving a trace. She, in turn, proved to be as resilient as he had hoped. The pampered city woman was gone, stripped away by necessity. In her place was a woman of quiet strength and fierce determination. She never complained about the cold, the hunger, or the exhaustion. She learned quickly, her hands, once soft and manicured, becoming chapped and capable. One afternoon, as they rested in a deep ravine, a sudden, violent rainstorm erupted, turning the dry creek bed into a raging torrent. They were nearly caught, scrambling up the muddy banks just as a wall of water roared past where they had been moments before. They found shelter under a rocky overhang, soaked and shivering, the world outside a blur of gray rain. The close call had rattled them both. "That was too close," Ilara said, her teeth chattering. "I thought—" "But we're safe," Jedediah said, his voice firm as he worked to build a small fire. "We're safe." They huddled together by the meager flame, sharing the warmth of their bodies. The constant threat, the shared hardship, had stripped away all pretense between them. In the flickering light, his face looked worn, the lines etched deeper by exhaustion. "Why are you doing this, Jedediah?" she asked softly, the question she had been holding in her heart for days. "The risk, the danger. You could have been a rich man." He stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. For a long time he was silent, and she thought he would not answer. "Because I know what it's like," he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "To have everything taken from you. To stand by and be helpless while the world burns down around you." He turned to look at her, his gaze raw and unguarded. 5 years ago, on this very mountain, a band of outlaws came through. They weren't looking for trouble, just supplies. But they were mean. They came to my cabin. Sarah, my wife, she tried to reason with them. And Thomas, my boy, he was only 6. His voice broke, and he had to stop, the memory of physical pain. "I fought," he continued, his voice thick with a grief that was still fresh. "But there were too many. They killed him. For a few sacks of flour and a horse." He looked down at his scarred hands. "I survived. And I've asked myself every day since why. Why me? What was the point of my survival if it was just to be alone?" He looked up, his eyes locking with hers. "When I found you in the snow, so broken, I saw a chance. Not to change the past, but to make my survival mean something. To not be helpless again." The confession hung in the small, damp space between them, a truth so painful and so profound it left her breathless. She saw him then, completely, not as a savior or a protector, but as a man as broken as she was, trying to find redemption in a single act of selfless courage. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. A current of understanding, of shared sorrow and nascent hope, passed between them. In that damp, cold shelter, surrounded by the storm, 2 lonely souls found a fragile, flickering warmth in each other. The moment of connection in the ravine changed everything. The unspoken tension between them, once born of fear and uncertainty, was now charged with a different kind of energy. It was in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, a look of profound tenderness that softened the hard lines of his face. It was in the way she found herself listening for the sound of his footsteps, her heart giving a small, traitorous leap when he was near. They were falling in love, a quiet, desperate love born in the crucible of their shared danger. They both knew it was a foolish, impossible thing. Their future was a blank, terrifying map, but the heart did not listen to reason. One evening they made camp in an abandoned line shack, a small, one-room cabin that had once been used by prospectors. It was the first time in over a week they had a solid roof over their heads. A cold, clear night settled, and the sky was a blanket of brilliant, glittering stars. After a simple meal of dried meat and coffee, they sat by the small, rusty stove, the silence, comfortable now, filled with unspoken words. "I used to look at the stars from my window in Denver," Ilara said softly, breaking the quiet. "I would pretend they were holes in the floor of heaven, and that the people I missed were looking down at me." Jedediah looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Who did you miss?" "My mother," she said. "She died when I was young. She was like you in a way. Quiet but strong. She taught me that you could find beauty even in the hardest places." She looked around the dilapidated shack. "I think she would have liked it here." He felt a tightness in his chest. He was used to the clean, sharp pain of his own grief. This feeling, this gentle ache for her, was new and terrifying. It was a feeling of hope, and hope was a more dangerous thing than any bounty hunter. "Ilara?" he began, his voice rough. He didn't know what he was going to say. He only knew he had to say something, to bridge the small distance between them. She turned to him, her eyes luminous in the starlight filtering through the single grimy window. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the small, forgotten cabin, adrift in a sea of wilderness. He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment. It was a gesture of complete trust, of surrender. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of a deep, aching tenderness. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sorrows and fragile hopes, of gratitude and a desperate, burgeoning love. It was a promise of a future that might never come, but that they would fight for together. When they broke apart, they simply looked at each other, the truth of their feelings laid bare between them. "Jedediah," she whispered, her hand covering his on her cheek. In that moment they were not a fugitive and her protector. They were just a man and a woman who had found each other in the darkness, and who were determined to walk toward the light, together. Meanwhile, the hunt had grown more focused, more relentless. Silas Croft was not a patient man. The initial search by the Redemption Posse had turned up nothing but the abandoned cabin. The cold trail and Jedediah's skill at hiding their tracks had frustrated the amateur trackers. But Silas had other resources. He had sent for a team of professional manhunters from Cheyenne, men who specialized in tracking fugitives for the railroad. They were cold, efficient, and ruthless. Their leader, a man named Fletcher, was a legend. It was said he could track a ghost over bare rock. Fletcher and his men picked up the trail where the posse had failed. They found the signs Jedediah had tried so hard to hide: a single displaced stone, a strand of wool from Ilara's cloak caught on a branch, the faint impression of a shod hoof in a patch of soft earth. They were slow, methodical, and they were closing the distance. Silas, consumed by a cold, obsessive rage, drove them on. He had abandoned all pretense of the concerned husband. His quarry had made a fool of him, and his pride demanded a reckoning. The $1,000 reward was no longer the point. This was about punishment. He pictured Ilara, his beautiful porcelain wife, in the hands of some rough, backwoods homesteader. The image fueled a possessive fury that was almost physical in its intensity. He imagined breaking the man, and then breaking her, reminding her of her place, of who she belonged to. Fletcher, a quiet, observant man, watched his employer with a detached professionalism. He had seen this kind of obsession before. It was dangerous, and it made men careless. "They're heading for the Teton Pass," Fletcher reported to Silas one evening as they made camp. "He's good, this rancher, very good, but he's burdened. The woman, the animals, they're slowing him down. We're gaining on them. 2 days, maybe 3, and we'll have them." Silas looked up at the jagged peaks of the Tetons, dark and menacing against the twilight sky. "Good," he said, his voice a low growl. "When you find them, I want the man alive. I want to look him in the eye." Fletcher simply nodded. His job was to find them. What happened after that was none of his concern, but he had a feeling that the coming confrontation would be bloody. The rancher, Stone, was not the kind of man who would be taken easily. He was a survivor, a man of the wilderness. Fletcher had seen the way he had prepared the abandoned cabin, the intelligence in the trail he had left. This wasn't just a farmer. This was a man who knew how to fight. The chase was no longer just a hunt. It was a collision course between two determined, implacable forces. Jedediah felt it in the air, a change in the pressure, a stillness in the forest that was unnatural. The birds were too quiet. He had been feeling it for a day, a prickling on the back of his neck, the instinct of the hunted. They were close, he knew it. He had pushed them hard, but their pursuers were relentless. "They're gaining on us," he said to Alara as they took a brief rest in the pre-dawn gloom. "I've been doubling back, trying to throw them off, but they're professionals. They're not the town posse." Fear, cold and familiar, touched her eyes. "What do we do?" He looked at her, then at the rugged landscape around them. They were in a narrow, winding canyon, its walls steep and strewn with boulders. It was a natural trap, or a natural fortress. A grim resolve settled over him. "We stop running," he said, his voice hard. "We can't outrun them forever. Not with the mule and the terrain. We have to make a stand, here." Alara looked at the canyon walls, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "Here?" "They'll follow us in," he explained, his mind already working, seeing the angles, the choke points. "The canyon narrows up ahead. It's a bottleneck. They'll have to come through single file. It's our only advantage." He was turning from prey into a predator, using the wilderness he knew so well as his weapon. The decision was made. There would be no more running. They would face their demons here, in this rocky crucible. He looked at Alara, his heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. He had brought this war to her, and now he had to finish it. "Alara," he said, his voice softer now, "you don't have to be a part of this. I can create a diversion, lead them away. You can take Goliath and ride for the pass." She looked at him, her eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen before. "No," she said, her voice unwavering. "Make a short move, and we will bring them back. I am not the woman you found in the snow, Jedediah. You taught me to be strong. You taught me to shoot. I am not leaving you. We started this together. We will finish it together." She picked up the rifle he had given her, her movements sure and steady. The transformation was complete. She was no longer a victim fleeing her past. She was a warrior, ready to fight for her future. A grim, proud smile touched Jedediah's lips. He had never felt such a powerful mix of love and fear in his life. He was terrified of what was to come, but he was no longer alone. He had an ally. He had a partner. Together they would make their stand. The hours before dawn were spent in a tense, focused silence. Jedediah worked with a deadly purpose, turning the narrow canyon into a calculated killing ground. He showed Alara a high ledge, a small, protected nook in the rock face that overlooked the narrowest part of the trail. "You'll be safe here," he said. "You'll have a clear line of sight. They won't see you until it's too late." He positioned the pack mule and Goliath further up the canyon, hidden in a small alcove out of the line of fire. He then went to work on the trail itself. He loosened rocks, creating the potential for a small rock slide. He found his own position across from Alara's ledge, a cluster of massive boulders that provided excellent cover. They were ready. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the canyon rim, they waited. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands on the rifle were steady. She thought of Silas, of his cold, cruel eyes. She thought of the life he had planned for her, and then she thought of Jedediah, of his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the way he had looked at her in the line shack. She was not just fighting against a monster. She was fighting for a future with a man she loved. Jedediah, hidden in the shadows of the boulders, felt a strange sense of calm. The waiting was over. The flight was done. The confrontation he had been running from for 5 years was finally here. This was his chance at redemption, his chance to rewrite the ending of his story. He would not fail. A sound drifted up the canyon, the clink of a horseshoe on rock, then another. They were coming. He peered through a crack in the boulders. He saw them, 5 riders moving cautiously up the trail. 4 were rough-looking men, professionals. The 5th, in the lead, was Silas Croft. Even from a distance, Jedediah could see the arrogance in his posture, the cold fury on his face. He felt a surge of pure, clean hatred. He raised his rifle, the cold metal of familiar comfort against his cheek. He waited until they were in the narrowest part of the canyon, right below Alara's ledge. "Now," he whispered to himself, and the world erupted in violence. His first shot took the lead rider's horse out from under him, sending the man sprawling. The canyon echoed with the sharp crack of the rifle, followed by the panicked whinny of horses. The hunters, caught by surprise, scrambled for cover. The battle had begun. The canyon became a chaotic symphony of ricocheting bullets and shouting men. Jedediah was a phantom, firing from one position behind the boulders, then moving, appearing in another spot, making his single rifle sound like three. He was patient, deadly. His shots aimed not to kill but to disable, to sow chaos. He hit one man in the shoulder, another in the leg, their cries of pain adding to the confusion. The professional hunters, led by Fletcher, were good. They quickly found cover and began to lay down suppressing fire, pinning Jedediah down. Bullets chipped away at the rocks around him, sending splinters of stone stinging into his face. Silas Croft, his initial shock turning to pure rage, took cover behind his dead horse, firing his pistol wildly in Jedediah's direction. "He's mine, Fletcher!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I want him alive!" But Jedediah was focused. His world narrowed to the sights of his rifle, the movements of his enemies. He was holding his own, but he was outnumbered. It was a matter of time. He knew he couldn't keep them pinned down forever. He risked a glance up at Ilara's position. She was hidden, safe. That was all that mattered. Then he made a mistake. He exposed himself for a fraction of a second too long as he moved between boulders. A bullet from Fletcher's rifle slammed into his side, a fiery, tearing pain that stole his breath and sent him staggering back. He fell heavily behind his cover, his rifle clattering on the rocks. The world swam in a haze of red. The pain was immense, a white-hot poker in his ribs. He pressed a hand to the wound, his fingers coming away slick and warm with blood. This was it, the ultimate price. He had known it was a possibility, a debt that might be called due. He had loved a married woman. He had defied a powerful man, and now he was paying for it with his life's blood. He could hear Croft's triumphant laughter. "He's hit! He's down! Move in! Get him!" The firing from the hunters intensified, a relentless hail of lead that kept him trapped. He tried to push himself up, to grab his rifle, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. His strength was failing. He was going to die here in this canyon, just as he had been destined to die 5 years ago. He had failed again. He closed his eyes, the image of Ilara's face filling his mind. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the uncarrying rocks. From her high perch, Ilara saw everything. She saw Jedediah's masterful dance of death among the boulders. She saw the flash of Fletcher's rifle, and she saw Jedediah fall. A scream of pure primal terror was trapped in her throat. For a single paralyzing moment, the old fear, the old helplessness, washed over her. She was the victim again, the fragile woman, watching her protector be struck down. Silas's triumphant shout echoed up to her, a sound that had haunted her nightmares. "Get him!" He was going to win. The monster was going to win. Then something inside her snapped. The fear did not vanish, but it was consumed by a tidal wave of rage. Rage at Silas. Rage at the world for trying to take another good man from it. And rage at herself for ever believing she was weak. She remembered Jedediah's voice, patient and calm. "Breathe out slow. Don't fight it. Become a part of it." She lifted the rifle. Her hands were no longer trembling. They were rock steady. Her world narrowed to the small metal sight at the end of the barrel. She wasn't the woman from Denver anymore. She was a woman of the mountains, a woman who knew how to survive, a woman fighting for the man she loved. She saw one of the hunters, a big, bearded man, break from cover, moving toward Jedediah's position. She centered the sight on his chest, took a slow breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, a familiar and powerful jolt. The shot was perfect. The man cried out and crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg. The sudden, unexpected shot from a new angle threw the attackers into confusion. "Where did that come from?" Fletcher yelled, spinning around, searching for the source. Ilara didn't hesitate. She worked the bolt, chambered another round, and fired again. This time she aimed for the rocks just above Silas's head, sending a shower of stone chips down on him, forcing him to duck back behind his horse. "Up there!" one of the men shouted, pointing toward her ledge. But they were exposed. They were trapped in the narrow canyon, caught in a crossfire. Her intervention had given Jedediah the one thing he needed: time. She was no longer a liability. She was his ally. She was his salvation. The tide of the battle had turned. Ilara's unexpected assault had thrown the hunters off balance, their disciplined attack dissolving into panicked, disorganized fire. Down below, Jedediah heard the sharp crack of her rifle, a sound as beautiful as any symphony. A fierce, desperate surge of adrenaline coursed through him, pushing back the pain. He was not dead yet. He gritted his teeth, tore a strip of cloth from his shirt, and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound in his side. He wasn't going to die here. Ilara was depending on him. He grabbed his rifle. Fletcher, the professional, had realized their disadvantage. "Fall back," he yelled to his men. "Get out of the canyon." He and the remaining uninjured hunter began to retreat, providing covering fire for their wounded comrades. But Silas Croft was not retreating. Consumed by a mad, possessive fury, he saw only Jedediah, staggering to his feet behind the boulders. He saw the man who had stolen his property, who had defied him. "No!" Silas screamed, his face a mask of rage. He stood up from behind his dead horse and charged forward, his pistol held in both hands, aimed at Jedediah's heart. It was a foolish, suicidal move. Jedediah, though wounded and weak, raised his own rifle. The two men stood for a frozen moment, the hunter and the homesteader, the embodiment of cruel power and rugged endurance. Time seemed to slow. Jedediah could have killed him. It would have been easy. A single pull of the trigger, and the source of all their misery would be gone. But as he looked into Silas's eyes, he didn't see a monster. He saw a pathetic, small man, made weak by his own greed and pride. Killing him would be an execution, not a victory. And Jedediah Stone was not an executioner. With a speed that defied his injury, he didn't fire. He lunged forward and swung the heavy rifle like a club. The stock connected with Silas's arm, sending the pistol flying. Silas cried out in pain and shock. Jedediah reversed the rifle and brought the butt of it down hard on Silas's head. The man crumpled to the ground in a heap, unconscious. Silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the groans of the wounded hunters and the distant panicked whinny of a horse. Jedediah stood over the fallen form of his enemy, his chest heaving, blood soaking his shirt. He was wounded, exhausted, but he was alive, and he was free. He looked up toward the high ledge and saw Ilara standing there, her rifle lowered, her face streaked with tears and gunpowder. Their eyes met across the space, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had fought, and won, together. The aftermath was a scene of quiet, exhausted relief. Fletcher and his men had retreated, taking their wounded with them. They were professionals, not fanatics. Their contract was with a man who could pay, and the unconscious Silas Croft was no longer in a position to do so. They left him where he lay. Jedediah, his side a constant throbbing fire, used rope to tie Silas's hands and feet. He would not kill the man, but he would see him face justice. He knew of a federal marshal based out of Fort Hall, an honest man who would be very interested in the testimony of a woman who had been trafficked by her wealthy, influential husband. He sent Ilara to fetch the horses, while he tended to his wound as best he could. When she returned, her face was a mask of worry. She gently pushed his hands away and took the cloth herself, cleaning the wound with water from their canteen. Her touch was tender, her movements sure. "You're a good nurse," he said, his voice raspy. "I'm a fast learner," she replied, a small, watery smile touching her lips. "And I had a good patient to practice on." He leaned his head back against the rock, the fight and the adrenaline leaving him weak. "You saved my life, Ilara," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "Up on that ledge, you were magnificent." "You saved mine first," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. "I think that makes us even." He reached up and touched her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a smudge of gunpowder. In that moment, all the pain, all the fear, all the running, it all faded away. All that was left was the profound, quiet truth of their connection. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them and had emerged, battered and bruised, on the other side. They had found each other in the darkness and had fought their way into the light. Later that day, leaning heavily on Ilara, Jedediah made it to the horses. They loaded the groaning, now conscious Silas onto the pack mule like a sack of grain. The journey ahead was still long, but it was a different kind of journey now. It was not a flight, but a pilgrimage. They were not running from something, but walking toward a future. As they rode out of the canyon, leaving the scene of their battle behind, the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold. It was the most beautiful sunset Jedediah had ever seen. 1 year later, the sun was setting again, casting long, golden shadows across the valley. But this was not the same valley of their battle. It was the valley that held Jedediah's ranch, his home. It was no longer a place of lonely exile, a fortress of grief. It was a place of life. The cabin had a new roof. The fences were mended. A small garden, vibrant with vegetables, grew near the front door. The sound of laughter, a sound that had been absent for so long, now echoed in the clear mountain air. Jedediah stood on the porch, his arm around Ilara's shoulders. The wound in his side had healed into a long, pale scar, another mark on a man who was a map of survival. But the deeper wounds, the ones on his soul, had begun to heal as well. Silas Croft was a distant memory. The testimony of Ilara, backed by the word of a federal marshal, had been enough to shatter his carefully constructed empire of lies. His creditors, no longer held at bay by his reputation, had descended like vultures. He had lost everything: his money, his influence, his freedom. He was a broken man, rotting in a federal prison. Justice had been served. Ilara leaned her head against Jedediah's shoulder. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, her hair tied back, her face glowing with a peaceful radiance. She was no longer the haunted, frightened woman he had found in the snow. She was strong, confident, and filled with a quiet joy. She had found her home not in a place, but in a person. After delivering Croft to the law, they had returned. They had faced the ghosts of his past together. Ilara had insisted they visit the small, simple graves behind the cabin. She had placed wildflowers on the markers for Sarah and Thomas, and had stood in silent respect. She had not tried to replace them, but to honor their memory by bringing life and love back to the man they had left behind. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly, her gaze on the distant, glittering lights of Denver that she could only see in her memory. "The city? The parties?" Jedediah looked down at her, a gentle smile on his lips. "Never," she said, her voice firm. "That was a cage. This," she said, gesturing to the vast, beautiful wilderness around them, to the simple cabin, to him. "This is freedom." He tightened his arm around her, pulling her close. The love they had found in the heart of danger had not faded. It had deepened, strengthened by the shared work of building a new life. They had healed each other, two broken pieces of a shattered world who had somehow, against all odds, bit together to make something whole and beautiful. As the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the mountain peaks, plunging the valley into a soft, peaceful twilight, Jedediah Stone knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he had finally found his redemption. It wasn't in a grand gesture or a heroic act. It was here, in the quiet moment, with the woman he loved by his side, at peace in the home they had made together.